Is protein deficiency even a realistic concern in the United States at this point?
No. Deficiency is extremely uncommon.
The RDA is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. When they made a guideline for the public, they went 2 standard deviations above the estimated average requirement. So they have a safety buffer on top of the safety buffer. Most people in the US, without ever realizing it, are actually getting 50% more than the RDA.
There are many people who are eating less than what would be considered optimal. 20-30% of the population, that's where the conversation becomes sensational. You extrapolate that to saying everyone isn't eating enough protein.
I get asked to talk about this topic often in a medical conference, and I'll say, how many of you have patients that are vegan or vegetarian? Pretty much everybody raises their hand. They have some. And then I say, how many of you in your career have ever treated an individual for protein deficiency in the US? To date, I've been doing this for 15 years. No one has raised their hand.
Welcome to your Brain On podcast with your hosts, Drs. Aisha and Dean Sherzai. Today, we are going to tackle a question that is loaded with controversy, culture, and confusion. Do we have to eat meat for a healthy brain? Dean, before we dive into this subject and introduce the phenomenal guests that we have, I'd love to ask you a question about what your experience has been related to this topic, eating meat and health in general, but specifically brain health. And why is it that it's such a touchy-feely subject? And why is there still a lot of confusion and controversy going on in that area?
It's extremely controversial, and it's understandable. It's controversial because it's something that's been with us for millennia, from the beginning of our existence. It has to do with more than just consumption. It is culture, it is family, it is identity. So whenever you bring this topic up, you're not bringing the topic in isolation. It's all those experiences that go with it, all the family stories. And we must have respect for that. Because if we don't, then we're really not addressing it truly. It's not just pure science where you find a p-value or a confidence interval and you say, here it is and the world should change. It doesn't. It must take into account the history that created this dilemma. The beauty of this is that if you take it in this sense, it helps us with all the other changes that we have to take on in public health. None of the things that we deal in public health is devoid of the totality of the cultural, familial, social aspects that we talk about. We've seen it in every conversation in the family. We've experienced it in every community we've been to. And to be honest, one thing that I take pride in is the fact that we've become more sensitive and more caring and more understanding of the whole spectrum of that expression. So I think this conversation is important beyond just the science of health. It is sociology, it's psychology, it's philosophy, it's religion. These are heavy topics.
I'm hoping that by introducing our guests and including their voice in this conversation, we're going to provide a framework of thought and agency for our audience so that they can make their own decisions moving forward, free of any bias, free of any cherry picking. And I'm so happy that the guests that have accepted to come on this show are incredible human beings to begin with, first of all, with a lot of integrity and capacity, and they're doing phenomenal work in their own realms. And they'll help guide us to understand the why and the what and the how of eating meat and its health outcomes.
I think one thing that should be done at the very onset is to get the audience ready with the idea that there's no bias in this conversation. The whole world has experienced this tension between eating meat or not eating meat.
Yeah.
And I want people to kind of come to this conversation realizing that we don't have a judgment. We do have a direction. We are ourselves plant-based and we don't eat meat. But we also want the audience to understand that we come to this conversation trying to make sure that we bring all the data to the topic without any bias. And as much as people think that's not possible, it is. Because if we recognize that everybody got to where we are with our beautiful and complex histories, then we try to understand and disentangle that as opposed to just clash heads and hope that in that clash you create a direction. It doesn't work like that.
Beautifully stated. All right. So first up, our guest is Dr. Christopher Gardner, who is a professor of medicine and a nutrition scientist at Stanford. He's led some of the most influential diet studies of the past 2 decades, including the landmark Diet Fits trial. And he is so passionate. I love when he speaks. I love his passion about shifting institutional food systems towards healthier and more sustainable, and as he puts it, unapologetically delicious meals. So here is Dr. Christopher Gardner. How are you, first of all?
Life is a roller coaster. It is exhilarating and terrifying from one minute to the next. Crazy times, misinformation is rampant, and it's so frustrating. Evidence-based science is under attack. It's being disregarded. These are really weird times.
It really is. Both of my children are in science, and I fear for them because of the misinformation that is just taking all this real estate of our minds and of our lives. How are we going to navigate through it? As a parent and as a responsible citizen, I am concerned. But we have people like you who make it easier to understand things better and bring the voice of reason. So I appreciate you so much. And it's a privilege to be here with you, Christopher. You're one of the most respected and innovative nutrition researchers in the world. For decades, you've been leading the conversation and showing how the foods that we eat affect our health. And you've done landmark clinical trials, and you've even shaped our dietary guidelines. What I admire about your work is how you cut through the noise of diet wars, even at a time when so many people feel confused by the conflicting messages. You remind us that there's more consensus than controversy. So you're not only a scientist, you're a teacher, you're a communicator who makes these issues very clear and practical. And I'm so excited to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, that's overly kind. I don't think it's all true, but I'm here to try.
So today's conversation is about nutrition in general, Christopher, but I would love for you to focus and help us understand the role of protein in our diet and this whole mix-up and confusion regarding meat versus plants. I'd love to start by just asking you about the general dietary guidelines. Why do you think nutrition research is so difficult, and why are people so confused about it?
So it's difficult because everyone eats, so it's so easy to feel like you're an expert. Like, I have personal experience, and I have relatives, and I have a trainer, and I have somebody else I know, and an uncle and an aunt, or a brother or a sister, and they say, and I read this thing, and it's one of those reinforcing things, like, I really want to eat my meat, or I really want to have my bagels, or I really want to have something. And one of the challenges in nutrition is the field is so rich with different studies and papers that if you did look hard enough, you could support almost any bias that you had by finding a single paper.
Yeah.
What I have to do usually is serve on the American Heart or American Diabetes or the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And we're supposed to find all the research and then come to a summary conclusion. Usually what happens, to be fair, and I think your listeners will appreciate this or not, is that rarely do we have all the studies that we need. So there's 3 levels in my mind, and the first level is just sort of plausibility. For decades, nutrition was founded on very isolationist, reductionist studies where they did one nutrient at a time in a petri dish or in a mouse, because then you could control all the confounding things. But a lot of those didn't relate to what people went to the grocery store to buy and what they ate it with under what conditions. There's another kind of research called observational epidemiology, which is very practical and expensive and takes a long time to conduct, and you get tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and you use inaccurate, but the best that we have, methods of diet assessment to see what people are eating. But we have a lot of these studies that track people for 30 and 40 years, and they know who ended up in the hospital, they know who died. When we looked at the data and teased it apart, the people who ate the most or the least of X had the most or least of this health outcome. And we think that could be important, but we do have to use the caveat that they also did or didn't smoke. They also did or didn't exercise. And so we can't actually prove that was the one thing that did it. But in the context of their lives, it was associated with that. So then the third pillar here is to do a randomized control trial. And that's a cause and effect thing. And so we got people to eat X. They had to change what they were eating. That's more definitive than we just observed some people and what they were already doing, because there's so many other factors associated with what they're already doing. For me, the best quick example is the exercise thing. Some people exercise a lot, some people don't exercise at all. And if I do a randomized trial and I randomize people to eat, let's say, Mediterranean versus keto, which was one of our studies, and somebody says, did you take exercise into account? I said, kind of. We had a crude measurement of it, but honestly, we didn't look that much into it because when we randomized, both groups had people who didn't exercise at all, some who exercised a little, and some who exercised a lot. We would assume those canceled one another out because of the process of randomization. But that is the kind of study that I do most of the time. And the hardest part there is, did they really eat what you asked them to? How do you know they ate what you asked them to? Even within that genre of study, the most rigorous is to house them and not let them leave and videotape them. Kevin Hall does this better than anyone else, and he usually does 20 people at a time for a few weeks. Some of my studies have been hundreds of people for a year. There's no way you can incarcerate people for a year like that. And so we take a lot of steps. We ask them a lot of questions. People always say, well, how do you know they really did it? What if they lied to you? And I said, well, that is a distinct possibility. We tried to make them value how important the science was in telling the truth. But that is a possibility. And now the American public wants an answer. Should they or shouldn't they eat it? That's why it's so hard and so confusing, because depending on what you want, you could say, I found a rat study that says I should do this. Oh, I saw this observational epidemiology report this. Oh, there's a randomized trial that found this. And you look at it more closely and you said, that's not the dose you're talking about. That's not the population you're talking about. And they fed it to people in a food that you don't actually eat. So that trial wasn't all that relevant to you. And a lot of that gets missed by people who say, look, I need to eat every day. I got to get breakfast, lunch, and dinner tomorrow. Don't you have a definitive answer today for me? I want the scientific answer today. And quite often our answer is, depends. What did you eat it with? What did you eat instead of that thing? And that context usually changes it. And so you'd have to be nuts to be a nutrition scientist. Like, why would you want this punishment of saying, I'm doing my best to do science and I'm trying to answer practical questions, but you're right. There are limitations to what I do, and I will try to present the limitations fairly. But by the time I'm done talking, you're going to say, wow, we don't know anything. And I would argue that we know a lot. If you go through time and see, for example, the dietary guidelines for Americans get updated every 5 years since 1980, and most of the recommendations have barely changed at all. The American Heart just updated their guidelines in 2021, and it had been 15 years since they updated them in 2006. They're almost identical to 2006. So at one level, it's, oh my God, throw up your hands, we don't know anything. And then on the other hand, oh my God, once again, they said we should be eating our vegetables and fruits, and we shouldn't have so much red meat and processed food. Don't eat added sugar. Feed your microbiome with fiber. So the newest thing, and I'd love your perspective on this, is for digesting information, people are looking for ways to receive it. You're providing it. Today, you're helping to provide it. It certainly would get more clicks if it said everything you thought you knew for 50 years is wrong, as opposed to, for the 17th time this year, I'm going to tell you veggies and legumes are good for you.
I appreciate that answer. And I just, as a neurologist and as someone who sits across people every single day with diseases of metabolism, diabetes, blood pressure, high LDL cholesterol, having some cognitive decline, my conversations are pretty boring. I just come down to the very basics, and I'm happy about that because that is the truth. At the same time, I find my patients or my community sending me a video or something they see out there. It's like, well, what about this one? Just because there's like a bombastic music in the background for that video, or somebody just comes with immense confidence and said, this is associated with this. If you eat these 3 things every single day, you will avoid Alzheimer's disease altogether. People are very confused. I think it's not being okay with being in that state of gray zone where you say, I know this much, but then there are all these things that I don't know. They feel uncomfortable with discomfort and not having a very definitive answer for everything. That's where things fall apart. And I wanted to touch on specific areas of confusion with you, Christopher. And I'm going to start on the concept of protein. Many people nowadays, you listen to different podcasts and you see all these reels on social media. Many people worry that they're not getting enough protein without the consumption of meat. From your research and the general consensus, we know that focusing on just meat or protein doesn't really make sense. I would love for you to shine some light on that from your research and your understanding. Is protein deficiency a real concern in the United States in 2025? Should we be worried about that?
So follow Marion Nessel. Read something that Eric Topol just wrote. I teach human nutrition to Stanford students, and there's one classic paragraph that I show every year, and it says, protein needs are of theoretical interest only. So we can describe the metabolism of protein and amino acids. It's actually quite interesting. But in reality, unless you're just eating junk food every day, in the absence of meat and poultry and pork and fish and eggs, if you had none of those, it would still be a challenge to not meet your protein need for the day. So can I give you the 3 myths of protein that I think are the easiest to dispel?
Please do.
So the first one has to do with the recommended daily allowance that we have in the US. A lot of people know this number, and it's funny that they know it because it's in kilograms, not pounds, but I'm happy to switch out for you. The RDA is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And if you don't like kilograms, it happens to work out to be 0.36 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Now, I got my PhD at Berkeley, and so I know this better than many people. Morgan Hall is where they teach nutrition, and the 5th floor of Morgan Hall is called the penthouse. Lore has it, because I wasn't getting my PhD in the 1970s. I was in high school. They took conscientious war objectors and had them live in the penthouse, not leaving. They were wearing suits that they would vacuum each day, trying to capture everything that left the body. They captured the pee, the poo, the nose blowings, the skin sloughing, hair that dropped off. They captured everything that left the body, and then they would monitor all the food going in the mouth. There's something called a nitrogen balance study that a lot of protein fanatics are upset with. So let me just describe nitrogen balance. It's a cool thing that scientists figured this out a long time ago. The main contributor to any nitrogen in our body was from protein. There's some other very minor contributors, but it's mostly protein. There's a methodological approach called the Kjeldahl method, Kjehdal, that somebody came up with 100 years ago. And if you take everything that left the body and burn it all up and just look at the nitrogen, you can basically figure out how much protein left your body that day. And then if you take all the food that you're eating, there's another way to look at all the nitrogen. If you mush, you take all the food you ate and put it in a big mush and just figure out the nitrogen, you'll know all the protein. And so this approach is called the nitrogen balance method. And for these people that were incarcerated, they lowered the protein level to 0 while they were monitoring what was leaving the body. They noticed that as people got lower and lower, they became more efficient and didn't lose as much protein. The body was smart enough to think, uh-oh, I'm not getting any, I better not waste any. But they know that's not how people eat, so they slowly raised the protein back up. And the point was to find balance. So if nitrogen in equals nitrogen out, you would be replacing your losses. I thought it was super clever. It's like a really cool scientific geeky way to figure out what that is. On the one hand, it is minimal. So this isn't optimal for muscle building and this isn't optimal for longevity. It's much more simplistic. It's just replacing your losses. When they did this, they found that somebody needed the most and somebody needed the least and everybody else was in the middle. And so let's just call this mathematically a normal distribution curve. So most people were in the middle somewhere, and they came up with a concept called the estimated average requirement. That is not what the RDA is, and I think a lot of people misunderstand this. Think of the population debacle that would happen if we recommended the estimated average requirement and everybody got it. By definition, half the population would be deficient.
Yeah.
So when they made a guideline for the public, it wasn't an individual approach, it was a population approach. And mathematically, they went 2 standard deviations above the estimated average requirement. Yeah. That 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, or 0.36 per pound body weight. In theory, according to this nitrogen balance method, anybody who got that had a 97.5 chance of meeting or exceeding their requirement.
Wow.
Exceeding it. And so I've heard people say, oh, I know what the RDA is, but I think I'm above average, so I'm going to have more. And the funny thing is that safety buffer is already in there for the dietary guidelines. And beyond that, if you look at our national intake data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination survey, women on average in the US get 1.1 grams per kilogram per day, and men get 1.3 grams per kilogram per day, much higher than 0.8 anyway. So they have a safety buffer already on top of the safety buffer. If people were to understand that the RDAs have a safety buffer built in, and that most people in the US, without ever realizing it, are actually getting 50% more than the RDA. So that's why there isn't an issue in almost every conference I go to, and I get asked to talk about this topic, often in a medical conference, and I'll say, how many of you have patients that are vegan or vegetarian? And pretty much everybody raises their hand. They have some. And then I say, how many of you in your career have ever treated an individual for protein deficiency in the US? To date, I've been doing this for 15 years. No one has raised their hand, but the funniest part is when you see the people in the front of the conference thinking, I don't, but I'm sure my colleagues must have. So I'm going to turn around and see how many. No one behind me? So that part is, I think, a misconception that we could help resolve, which most people are getting more protein than they require to replace their losses. So they're getting extra. So what happens at the end of every day? If you get extra fat in your diet, you have an infinite capacity to store it. It can be in your belly, in your butt, in your underarms, in your face, in the pads of your hands. And if you have any marathon runners listening, what's the capacity to store carbohydrate? It's quite limited, actually. It's only in your liver and your skeletal muscle. And marathon runners know the bonk that happens for a lot of people 20 miles into the 26.2 mile marathon is when you've exhausted all your carbohydrate stores, and you better have some goo or something because you're going to start get fatigued and get a little hazy. So we know that you can store carbohydrate in two specific places, but only to a limited capacity. So if there's infinite capacity to store fat and a limited capacity to store carb, I ask this a lot and nobody really ever knows the answer. How much protein can you store and where? Okay, I'm just going to let your audience suffer right now. Like, wait, no one ever asked me that one. Yeah. Let's see. Is it my spleen? Is it my pancreas? The reason they won't come up with an answer is there's no storage depot in the human body to store extra protein. There isn't any place to do it. It'll be circulating in your blood for a while, but at the end of the day, if you made all your enzymes and hormones and repaired some of your cells and hair and fingernails, you turn the carbon skeleton, which is most of the protein amino acid, into carbs. If your glycogen is all full, because that's the storage form of carbohydrate, then you turn it into fat anyway. A second part of sort of the wackadoodle protein myth is, I made sure I got my 150 or 200 grams of protein per day. And you just turned almost all of that into carbs because there isn't a place to store it. I'm pretty sure everybody knows you can't sit on the couch and binge watch television and eat protein and just watch yourself swell up with bigger and bigger muscles. Stu Phillips, who's an exercise physiologist, suggests that of muscle growth for the people who are interested in building bigger muscle, 90% or more is your workout, and less than 10% is trying to get enough protein.
Very true.
So there's no place to store it. The third myth to bust is that plants are missing amino acids.
Yes.
For the record, is this a bias? I'm not sure. Is it a self-defense? Maybe. So I haven't had any beef, chicken, poultry, or egg for 43 years. And about 15 years ago, I stopped eating eggs and dairy and ice cream and things like that. One of the reasons I got a PhD, to be honest, really, I was going to have a restaurant a long time ago, 45 years ago. I got so sick of people asking me, but where do you get your protein? That I thought, maybe if I had a master's degree in nutrition, I'll open my restaurant. And when they ask me, I'll have an articulate academic answer. And by mistake, I got a PhD. And by mistake, I got a faculty position at Stanford and ran all these trials. But I can explain it now. So I think the best way to explain it is to ask how many of your audience and listeners have ever played Scrabble. And usually when I ask that question, everybody's played Scrabble at least once.
Of course.
Protein is basically the building blocks of amino acids, and there's 20 of them. And they're really very similar to Scrabble letters, the tiles in that board game. So I like to think of it as that bag of letters, and I bet few people have ever counted them, but there's 100 tiles in the bag. And there's 26 letters in the alphabet. And so everybody knows 100 divided by 26. Yeah, there's 4 of each letter. No, there's not. There isn't 4 of each letter. The Scrabble board game has 1 Z and 1 X and like 12 A's and 9 E's. And that's actually how protein works. So of all the 20 amino acids, some are very common and some are very rare. Glutamate, glutamine, lysine, you need a lot of those, and tryptophan, cysteine, you hardly need any of those. The key to adequate protein isn't getting a total amount of protein right, it's getting the proportion right. So here's what I've heard for the last 40 years. I have heard quinoa, the only plant food that has all 9 essential amino acids. It is bullshit. Like, all plants actually have all 20 amino acids, including all 9 essential amino acids. All of them. And I hear people say they're missing, they're incomplete. They get a little fuzzy when they try to describe this, but they are quite sure that the plant proteins are inferior. And part of that perception is correct, but it's to a much smaller extent than most people realize. And so really what's going on is, if you were to look at the proportions, grains in particular are low in lysine. They actually have a little extra methionine and cysteine, which is important because beans are a little low in methionine and cysteine. But interestingly, they have a little extra lysine. So there's this really old thing that Frances Moore Lappé pushed in Diet for a Small Planet, where she said, the key to all this is complementing your proteins. Just have your beans and your grains together, and they will complement one another. And at one level, that's correct. But to be honest, if you got 80 grams of protein a day, it wouldn't matter if they were complemented well or not. So if you or I needed 40 grams of protein, the RDA is more like 50 or 60 grams per day. So if your actual requirement, minus the safety buffer, was 40, and you got 40 only from beans, that was the only thing you ate all day, or only from rice, it wouldn't be enough. Just rice protein, 40 just bean protein, wouldn't be enough, because then you would be short on lysine, or you would be short on methionine and cysteine. And yet, let's go back to this Scrabble game. I have 4 kids. I played Scrabble with them forever. And as they all got older, at one point, every one of them said, here, Dad, here's a word. I'm missing this one letter, but it's the only letter I'm missing, so I'm going to play this and substitute that letter. You can't just substitute a letter and make a word. You have to have all the right letters in Scrabble to make your Scrabble word. And so that's just how amino acids work. So imagine that you had a Scrabble board where you had lost an L for lysine and an M for methionine, and it turns out you had a neighbor who also had Scrabble and hadn't played it in a really long time, and they were going to help you out by giving you their bag of letters. And for some bizarre reason, they had also lost an L and an M, and both bags were short on L and M, but not absent. So because there's multiple L's and multiple M's, all you'd have to do is take the second bag and borrow an L or M or 2, and you would have a complete bag. So now let's picture what happens. You think, but now I have 2 bags of Scrabble letters. The proportions aren't perfect, but now I have another bag. And so let's just continue the game. And if you really are a Scrabble player, you know that by the time you've used all the letters in the bag, there's almost no room on the board for any more words. It's the end of the game and I'm losing, and I have this 7-letter stretch, and as soon as I place it on the board, I'll win, but there's no room on the board for my letters. What am I going to do with the extra letters? I think we could glue them together and make Jenga pieces out of them, because you can't use them for Scrabble anymore. You're going to have to save those other extra letters for another day, another game. They're not going to help you right now. Plants are not missing as in completely deficient. They're just there in a smaller proportion. And if you get a reasonable variety of food and you're not only eating beans all day or only eating grains all day, you probably don't even have to think too much about complementing your proteins if you're a vegan or a vegetarian. So if you now take into account myth 1, the RDA is based kind of on the minimum, but it has a safety buffer built in. It isn't the minimum. And if you think about, well, I'll just eat extra so I can store it today for tomorrow in case I don't get enough tomorrow, that won't work. You can't store it. And if you were worried that plants were missing amino acids, they aren't. They have all 20, and the proportions aren't perfect, but they're pretty darn close. This is across vegetables and beans and grains and nuts and fruits. Yes, there's more protein per calorie in meat, but that only becomes important if you're not getting enough total protein for the day. And in the US in particular, there's quite a few global graphics of protein intake and meat intake. And in the US, in North America in general, we eat more meat than any other place in the world. Is there room to cut back on that? Yes, partly because we only get half the RDA for fiber, and fiber feeds the microbiome, and we're finding out how cool the microbiome is. So why not get a little more of your protein from beans and legumes, less from meat, and get some fiber with that. So you will meet your protein needs and you'll get the fiber for your microbiome along with some plant antioxidants. There's hardly ever any antioxidants in animal foods, always found in vegetables and fruits and beans and nuts and seeds. So those are my sort of 3 myths of protein.
I love it.
And despite how much evidence there is for that, the country has just gone wackadoodle for protein.
That was probably one of the most exciting and entertainment explanation of the concept. Now, every time I'll look at my bowl of tofu and rice and beans, I'll think of Scrabble, getting the Scrabble words right. Thank you for that. People need to realize that there is data suggesting that if you only rely on red meat or processed meat for your protein, it comes with negative consequences. We have plenty of data showing that if you only eat meat and cut down on vegetables and whole grains and nuts and seeds, it has consequences. We know that when you eat more red meat, in my field, it has been associated with higher risk of stroke, both ischemic, hemorrhagic not so much, but ischemic stroke. And the proxies are higher LDL, potentially some other metabolic risk factors that lead into that as well. I want you to tell us what your thoughts are on that as far as meat consumption and health outcomes are concerned based on your research.
Oh, yeah. The things I know I can lower and publish on and write a grant for are LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, insulin, glucose, blood pressure. So the red meat and the sodium that often goes with it to season it have always been associated with worse heart health outcomes. So that's been a staple of the American heart since I became involved with them back in 1993. So there's actually quite a few observational epi studies on red meat and diabetes. The Cancer Institute has named red and processed meat as a carcinogen. I would really like to be more articulate for neurology and Alzheimer's disease and cognitive function. And so that is why I am one of your biggest fans, appreciating what an important outcome that is. I think people are finding more and more this same diet pattern that we're promoting for general health and heart health and diabetes and weight management is just as important for neurology and mental health.
Agreed.
You and I are eventually going to do a study together because of the overlap that is there. We just have to find the right hypothesis and the right funding mechanism.
Absolutely. And we're working on that on the Inspire project. We're so glad to be collaborating with you, and that is coming to life. LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, insulin, glucose, all of these metabolic risk factors. There's so much overlap between heart health and brain health, and we're seeing that when you take care of those things, you do better. What are your thoughts about people? They feel that LDL may not be an intermediary factor between diet and cardiovascular health outcomes like diabetes. They say, oh, it's not LDL, it's something else. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so there isn't any risk factor that explains all disease outcome.
Agreed.
Not ever. LDL, I actually think LDL is probably exaggerated because long ago we found a drug that lowers it really effectively. We have a drug for LDL cholesterol. The field at one point moved from total cholesterol to LDL and HDL. When they did that, it wasn't all the cholesterol in the blood that was bad. The LDL carrying particles had worse associations with outcomes than the HDL particles. In the same way, they thought if we further disaggregated LDL into small, dense, and fluffy puffy, that would make a difference. And I will say that people who go low carb get fluffier, puffier LDLs and fewer small, dense LDLs. You can show that again and again. But really, at the end of the day, it's more particle number. And there's a surrogate measure for that. It's called apolipoprotein B. It's a protein that's on the surface of the LDL particle. Even though it does help explain more of the different outcomes, LDL is still bad. We just found that if 2 people had high LDL and somebody had more of the fluffy puffy and somebody had more of the small dense, the person with the more small dense LDL had a higher risk of heart disease. That doesn't mean the fluffy puffy LDL person was blessed for life, that they would never have a heart attack.
Yeah.
Another difference beyond LDL and HDL. My boss is a preventive cardiologist, and he sees people doing these high saturated fat, high meat diets with their LDL going through the roof, and they show up in his clinic saying, but I'm fine. I haven't even have it tested, but I've been listening to social media. And because I have this very low carb, keto-like diet, I'm fine. I'm pretty sure my LDL are the fluffy puffy type, and I'm not worried about my high LDL at all. And clinically, they're not seeing that at all. Clinically, it continues to be a risk. It's an important risk. And it is one of the risk factors that we can lower with diet, and if not diet, if it's genetic in its origin, with medications. We have really powerful medications. But to be honest, diet is a really powerful lowering agent for LDL.
Yeah.
And it really isn't the carb issue as much as it is the saturated fat. I am opposed to added sugars, refined grains. I would love it if Americans would eat a lot fewer carbs by having less added sugar and refined grain. But the saturated fat is not vindicated. It is still a bad player. Fiber is still good, and that gets left out a lot. Low saturated fat, high fiber is the best way to lower your LDL cholesterol. And that would be with beans, peas, and lentils.
Amazing.
Right there.
Yeah. Amazing. I want to highlight your research. You get a lot of social media influencers who are saying alternative meats and products that people could potentially use if they absolutely love the taste of meat or the texture of meat. Oh, well, it's processed. But then you went on to do this elegant study and you explained it that it's quite the opposite, that there may be the saturated fats or the LDL factor that is the most important pivot point around that.
So I had seen 3 full-page New York Times ads back when they were starting to emerge, saying, oh, these new plant-based meats, they're basically dog food. And the high saturated fat from coconut oil will raise your LDL, and the high sodium will raise your blood pressure. Because of a study like Kevin Hall's, the processed food will make you heavier. Stay away from those plant-based meats. And at that point, I thought, wait, the plant-based meats are better for the planet, and they're better for animal rights and welfare. But you're right, maybe the health issue is a question here, but oh my God, that's what I do for a living. I could design this study. So we called it Swap Meat, my best acronym ever. So the study with appetizing plant food, a meat eating alternative trial. And we compared 2 servings a day of Beyond Meat with 2 servings a day of red meat. To be even more specific, we didn't serve low quality red meat. We went to a distributor in San Francisco who only served organic, pasture raised, regenerative farmed, expensive meat. We actually called it a healthy plant meat and a healthy red meat, healthier than what some of the options would be. We got 36 people to do 2 servings a day for 8 weeks on both of those and cross over and do the other ones. Each one was their own control. One of the outcomes we looked at is sort of an emerging risk factor in the field of cardiovascular disease, trimethylamine oxide. It has more to do with inflammation than it does with the cholesterol lowering in your blood. That actually got better on the plant food arm. The LDL cholesterol went down, not up, on the plant food arm. You could see that even though it had saturated fat from coconut fat, it still had less saturated fat than the red meat. They actually lost a couple pounds on the plant meat phase compared to the red meat phase. They didn't gain weight. They lost weight. It wasn't very much, but it was actually statistically significant because it was quite consistent. Almost everybody was about 2 pounds lower after 8 weeks on the plant-based meat. For blood pressure, there was no difference in the groups, and I found this quite interesting, and we thought, well, actually when we looked at the plant-based meat products, they did have more sodium than the patties of beef and the ground beef that we were giving the participants. What was probably obvious, and we should have thought of at the beginning, and I'm sure your listeners will appreciate, what did the participants do when they got raw ground beef and raw beef patties? They seasoned them with salt. And so by our calculation, the salt intake was identical on the 2 phases and the blood pressure wasn't different. So this is a very specific case. It was a specific dose, a specific population. It wasn't all plant meats are better all the time than all of everything else. So the kinds of studies I do are this dose in this population with this product does this. And when we did it, 3 things were better with plant-based meat, and nothing was better in the animal-based phase of all the things that we had measured. The immediate response I got, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, was, Professor Gardner, oh my God, I can't believe you're not recommending beans, peas, and lentils. How could you possibly be recommending these? And I said, wait, let's think about what the study was. It wasn't Beyond Meat instead of beans, peas, and lentils. It was Beyond Meat instead of red meat, because I've been doing this for 30 years. And I've been suggesting we should eat less red meat, and people aren't eating a lot less red meat. The U.S. is still #1 for eating red meat in the world. So maybe these plant-based meats could be a gateway drug to beans, peas, and lentils. Maybe if they weaned themselves off of the red meat and said, oh, these are pretty good. These are okay. Oh, and actually there's a lentil soup. Oh, and maybe I'll have the beans and rice here. And oh, maybe I'll have hummus out of chickpeas. So I'm hoping we'll continue down that path. But if you really wanted to ask the question, are they healthy? I would just flip it back to you and it says, it depends. What are you having it instead of and what are you having it with? And if it was instead of red meat and if it wasn't with white bread bun and special sauce, pickled cheese, lettuce, whatever that McDonald's jingle is.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually think it's better from a health perspective and better for the planet and better for animal rights and welfare.
I love that. I love your message, and I'm so glad you said that. What is your hope for the future of nutrition as far as research is concerned? Technology is moving fast. Are you excited? Are you scared? What do you think?
I don't think research is changing much. And my research is actually shifting to not only a behavioral perspective and including environment. I'm hanging out with chefs and I'm getting back to the idea of taste and unapologetic deliciousness and thinking that more and more Americans are eating outside the home and that doesn't seem to change. So what if we could change school food, university food, hospital food, worksite food, prison food, military food, and the chefs who are in charge hug a chef and say, "Thank you, chef, for making this food unapologetically delicious and keeping human health and environmental health in your back pocket so that we're not shaming people." Being aware of human health, environmental health, and the aspirational diet could hit all of those and even include social justice for the laborers in our slaughterhouses, in our meatpacking industry, which is a pretty dangerous place to work. So there's a lot of wins across different domains there.
I love speaking with Christopher. He's so brilliant. And from the start, he reminds us why nutrition feels so overwhelming. Why is there so much confusion? I love how he just laid that out. And, as he says, everyone eats, everyone has an opinion, and misinformation thrives in that realm. But at the same time, I also appreciate his optimism because he believes that the core advice hasn't really changed over the decades. It's essentially more fruits and vegetables, more beans, more sources of fiber, less saturated fats, and less processed foods. This dietary pattern seems to be the best dietary pattern for all of our systems, whether it's the brain or the cardiovascular system or the GI, et cetera, to translate such a confusing and a complex subject into something palatable, pardon the pun, in nutrition is wonderful. I think he's one of the few people who does it beautifully.
He does the science well, and he does the communicating of the science well, which is rare.
Agreed. That's very true. I also love the fact that he gives so much importance to chefs as much as he gives importance to nutrition scientists. And he says that those are the individuals that are going to slowly and gradually change how we relate to food. And he's absolutely right. I mean, if school lunches, if our hospital meals, if our workplace cafeterias, if they have delicious plant-based or at least plant-forward meals, it's going to be easy to adhere to it. And that's really going to change public health in a way.
I definitely agree. I think chefs or the culinary engineers and the magic that they do, and it's changing, and their tools are getting better, and their ability to create taste, texture, and experience is getting better and better because we have more knowledge. I think that's going to be the secret. Yes, the data and the science mean a lot, but to be honest, on a day-to-day basis, a majority of our patients in the communities, they have 2 to 3 jobs, they drive long distances, and the only thing they have access to is this fast food world that is filled with foods that are high energy. They've been filled with salt and sugar and these addictive products. It's difficult to fight that. The only way that one can counter that is a culinary experience that is tasty, easy, and healthy.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Our second guest is the amazing Dr. Adrian Chavez. Adrian is a PhD nutrition scientist, and he's an amazing science communicator with a passion for nuance. I love how he debunks oversimplified health trends, and he helps people make decisions about their nutrition, and he provides such wonderful guidance without any blame and shame and fear. And I'm so grateful that he spent time with us to speak about this topic. So here is Dr. Adrian Chavez. Adrian, it's always such a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. You are one of the voices of reason in the field of nutrition, which can get pretty confusing and pretty cantankerous. I'm going to use big words here. And it's wonderful to have someone who understands the nuance. Of course, you're highly educated. You've spent a lot of time studying nutrition. But what I value more is you've also worked with human beings. You have clients and you work with patients. And I think For those of us who work with human beings in the community, when you actually work with people and they tell you what their difficulties are or what their strengths are, you have a very special perspective of the language that you use to convey information on nutrition. And I absolutely love how you convey that. So thank you so much for your time. And I truly appreciate what you stand for and how you communicate with everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You're so kind.
All right, so today's conversation is about meat specifically. Whenever the concept comes forth, people start thinking about protein. From some of the rhetoric and the conversations online and social media, and even in our families, most people, especially those who are getting to the ages of 65 and above, are worried that they're not getting enough protein, especially if they don't eat meat. From the kind of research that we have and from your understanding, is protein deficiency even a realistic concern in the United States at this point?
No, deficiency is extremely uncommon. There are many people who are eating less than what would be considered optimal, and that I'd say is 20-30% of the population. It's not everyone, and I think that's where the conversation online becomes a little extreme and sensational. You take something that may be affecting 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people, and you extrapolate that to saying everyone isn't eating enough protein. The reality is that there's a subset of the population who are just having quite low protein intake. It's enough to meet the guidelines. The U.S. dietary guidelines are 50 grams of protein per day, which is enough to prevent a overt deficiency that would cause symptoms in an acute setting. But the way that we're looking at protein now as opposed to deficiency is there going to be a negative impact of eating a lower amount over the course of your lifetime? Is that going to negatively impact muscle mass? Is that going to negatively impact bone? Is that going to negatively impact other aspects of health that may be dependent on the amino acids that come from those proteins? The immune system is also highly dependent on some of those amino acids. So that's the concern there. People aren't gonna develop an overt deficiency, but are there negative consequences to consuming a low amount that is above the guidelines but still on the lower end? There has been a lot of research and discussion in the scientific community about potentially increasing dietary guidelines to reflect the higher value that would be more reflective of what would be considered quote-unquote optimal protein intake for healthy aging and metabolic health.
And from the consensus that we have so far, I understand that for someone who is just a generally healthy person, not going through any metabolic issues, anywhere from 0.8 grams per kilograms of body weight to 1.2 grams per kilograms of body weight is appropriate. And if somebody is going through a health issue, for example, or if they're recovering from a disease or they need more protein to build more connective tissue and muscle, it could go up to 2 grams per kilograms body weight. Is that appropriate? Is that correct?
Yeah, most of the evidence shows that the benefits in those specific circumstances, for example, for someone trying to build muscle or someone recovering from surgery, most of those benefits will top out at around 1.6. But in unique circumstances where there is a lot of tissue repair occurring, there may be benefits of higher amounts of protein for shorter periods of time. But over the course of a lifetime, 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight seems to be that level. There seems to be maximal benefit from a body composition standpoint and metabolic health standpoint where there's no advantage to going beyond that.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this debate or the conversation about quality of protein. I think we all agree on the quantity conversation as you eloquently presented right now. What are your thoughts on some people saying the quality of protein matters too, and sometimes lean animal proteins may be better because it is a quote-unquote better quality? What are your thoughts on that?
So there's some truth to that, like most things that circulate online. So there are more of essential amino acids and branched chain amino acids that are going to be used and be able to be used to produce the non-essential amino acids or higher amounts of the non-essential amino acids as well. And so there is some truth to the proteins in animal foods containing higher amounts of these essential amino acids. However, is that relevant to improving health, improving body composition over the long term in the context of eating enough protein? So if someone's eating a very low protein diet, that's a circumstance where the quality of those proteins may make more of a difference. However, if someone's meeting their protein needs, the specific amino acid composition of those proteins doesn't seem to matter as much because you're eating enough of all of the amino acids to provide for your various needs throughout the body, because these amino acids, they're used in various functions throughout the body. Let's say, for example, if you're eating a lower protein diet and you're eating mostly lower quality proteins, it may be more difficult to supply some of the needs that would be required for leucine for muscle building. That amino acid, you may not be getting enough of that to really support muscle tissue. And so in those cases, on a lower protein diet, that's when it does become more important in terms of amino acid composition. But really the overall messaging and the thing that we really need to be focusing on is eating enough protein. Within that context, from a health standpoint, there's quite a bit of evidence to show that higher consumption of plant protein within the context of eating enough protein is going to have a positive effect on a variety of health outcomes.
There have been some systematic reviews that have looked at specific consumption of processed meat not being good for brain health and has been associated with faster cognitive decline. But when you look at the dietary patterns that have been labeled as brain healthy and associated with better brain health, like the Mediterranean diet or the MIND diet or the DASH diet, it essentially is a scoring system. And if people cut down on red and processed meat, they tend to do better. Of course, managing everything else, which is more omega-3s, more fiber, more phytochemicals for plants. And I feel like this is where the nuance is usually lost. It's not a yes and no. It's not a black and white. It's how much, who is the subject, what kind of foods do they need, what kind of health outcomes are they looking for. That's where most of the things get a bit murky and people get confused. And unfortunately, nutrition is not straightforward, especially nutrition research is not very straightforward. It's a messy area. And I think there's more consensus than controversy about what you just stated. Going back to that, if someone is aiming for better health, for, say, for example, lower risk of cancer or lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, lower risk of cardiovascular diseases, which includes stroke as well, I think there's enough data to show that if you eat more plants and if you get more plant proteins, you do better. How do you balance that? And what do people need to watch out for, especially when it comes to protein intake and better health outcomes?
Yeah, so I think the other side of that discussion is eating more plant protein, better health outcomes. Eating more animal protein, it's a bit mixed, and it's mixed because there's different types of animal proteins that have different aspects to the type of food. So we're talking about protein, but really proteins are coming from certain foods. And what foods are those? There's different types of animal foods that go into a few different categories. You got dairy, eggs, and then you have fatty fish, non-fatty fish, and then you have red meat, which would include, I think red meat you have to separate between processed red meat, fatty red meat, and then lean red meat. And then also with this, you have to consider the cooking application of the red meat, because cooking it over an open flame or cooking it over high heat and creating that charring effect is going to have some impact as well. And same, we have to consider poultry and pork. And so there's a variety of different things that we're thinking about when we're thinking about protein. When you mention eating more plant or eating more animal protein, that could be a good thing if your sources of animal protein are the sources that are least likely to have negative effects overall. And we talked about processed meat. That's very clear. There's no dispute with the evidence there. Processed meat sources such as bacon, sausage, lunch meats. And lunch meats, I feel like, is a gray category because many of them are processed in the similar ways, but they're fresher options that have different preservatives and things. And all of that gets lumped together in the research. So I think lunch meats is a bit of a gray area, but the bacon, the sausage, potted meat, pepperoni, all of these cured types of meats, that processed meat is clearly associated with several negative health outcomes. So when we think about meat, that's the type of meat that we probably want to limit the most. And then fatty red meat is the type of meat that we also want to pay attention to. Probably fatty pork along with that as well, putting those into that same category. And then lean red meat. Most of the studies show neutral effects with lean red meat, but the ones that don't show a negative effect. So it's mostly neutral, but there are some that show slightly higher risk of cardiovascular disease, of cancer, when we're looking at just lean red meats. The risk associated with consuming those on a regular basis is there's probably some risk, but a lot of the studies are neutral, and that probably depends on other factors like overall dietary pattern, cooking method, because as I mentioned earlier, when you expose these red meats, all meats, to very high heat, especially direct flame, you're creating these compounds, these polycystic aromatic hydrocarbons, advanced glycation end products, and these compounds create damage within our body. It's almost like eating fried food. And so when you're eating red meat that's been charred, that's been barbecued, you're creating all of these oxidative byproducts that are very similar to what you would experience if you ate fried food. So I think that's probably driving some of the negative effect of red meat consumption on various health outcomes. There's not a lot of studies that have looked at that because we didn't really understand these things until more recently, so that wasn't taken into account. But when that's isolated, there seems to be some negative effects of smoked and barbecued meats. I live in Texas, right in Austin, where there's amazing barbecue restaurants everywhere. People don't like to hear this, but that can be mitigated to a significant degree with marinades that include antioxidant micronutrients. So if you're using lemon and herbs, you can actually reduce the production of those compounds by like 80-90%, but they are produced when you use those cooking methods. And like I mentioned, I think that's driving a bit of the risk. Lean meat that is cooked not over an open flame, is not heavily charred, with minimal consumption a couple of times a week, probably very low risk for most health outcomes. And with poultry, similar situation, much evidence to show negative effects of consumption of poultry unless it's very high consumption. When we look at the people who are just very high consumers of all meat in general, but I think most studies aren't separating lean, fatty poultry. That's just the challenge with research, and I think that would offer an additional information there, is like the lean versus the fatty poultry, I think would be different outcomes as well, to where there's a bit of a risk associated with fattier poultry and probably not at all with the lean poultry options.
Thank you for that. That really makes sense. And recently there's been some papers on advanced glycation end products and heterocyclic amines being associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Most of them are mechanistic studies, so we're still waiting on larger human studies to see it. But I think mechanistically it makes sense, especially when we've seen the outcomes with other proxies of metabolic diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure. There is some evidence that cooking methods, like you said, especially barbecuing or direct hot heat on meat, can create compounds that are associated with other neurodegenerative diseases like essential tremor. My mentor at Columbia University, Dr. Lewis, was studying harmane, which is a compound, and his entire focus of research was harmane and essential tremor that is usually produced when meat is barbecued or charred, when there's burnt bits of meat on it. So it makes sense. And I know for someone living in Texas and saying that out loud, more power to you.
People do not like to hear it. I don't like to hear it.
Yeah, I know. Do you think that there are any situations where you believe that eating meat, and I'm saying meat including everything else that you added into the umbrella category, does it provide any unique health benefits, or do you think that people can, in a healthful way, include plant proteins throughout their lives and their dietary patterns for better health outcomes?
I wouldn't say meat provides unique health benefits. It is just a more concentrated source of certain nutrients that can be beneficial that may be more difficult to get on a plant-based diet. So we talked about the protein, and yes, you can get enough protein on a plant-based diet, but a lot of people that I've met and worked with who have followed a plant-based diet for a long period of time are just not mindful of the protein intake and eating legumes and lentils, and soy has to be a foundation of something that you're including in every meal, and that's not happening a lot of times. So naturally, you will get higher amounts of protein on an omnivorous diet, and that's one reason that I think there tends to be perceived benefit there, is because it does take a bit more planning if you are on a strictly plant-based diet. The other thing in some cases, and this is a pro and a con, is iron, but particularly for women, there's about 20% of the female menstruating population who have low iron levels that can impact cognition. And yes, you can get iron from plant foods, but it is not the heme iron, and in some cases, including that in the diet may have some benefits there. Also, animal food sources, better sources of omega-3 fats, better source of choline. And so there's some specific nutrients that are going to be more concentrated and easier to get when you're just eating an omnivorous diet. That's the primary reason that I personally eat an omnivorous diet, is because it's just a bit easier for me and less planning, and I do eat a predominantly plant-based diet, but I wouldn't say there's a major health benefit that we can identify, but I think there's circumstances where including animal foods can help people to better meet certain nutritional needs. So a well-planned, well-educated plant-based diet, I think, is, you're not going to get any advantages to going from that to including animal foods, but the average person who's not paying attention to those things as closely, if they were including animal foods in moderation, I think there's probably some advantages to that, because that would allow them to meet certain nutritional needs that they probably would be a little bit low on if they weren't.
I agree. And especially if they are mindful of how they prepare the meat, right? Like you said, making sure that it is cooked properly, it's lean, staying away from saturated fats, because we know that saturated fat intake has been associated with poor health outcomes. So that could potentially be easier. And I agree with you that a planned plant-based diet is very important, and it requires some awareness of what some replacements are. Like, for example, as a nutritionist, you're the expert. How would you speak to someone who is trying to eat a plant-exclusive diet, and what would you tell them, like what the sources of protein would be for them?
Exactly what you just said. You just listed them all. The only other thing is companies are getting better at plant-based meat substitutes. And that was something that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the options on the market were not very good. They weren't very nutritious. They didn't taste very good. And there's a lot of better options on the market now that can really like help meet protein needs, that are just, it'll be like textured vegetable protein, mostly pretty high protein amounts. For example, there's a certain type of textured vegetable protein burger that I give to my son. It's 16 grams of protein, 150 or 60 calories, and that's better than a burger, like an actual meat burger that people are having in terms of the protein amounts. That's one thing that I'd add to that, is incorporating some of those things in can be helpful as well, especially with kids. If you have kids that are plant-based, and I get that question quite a bit. I feel like the younger population of kids being raised right now, there's going to be a much higher amount of kids who just choose not to eat meat. I've seen that in my son's school and his friends, and it's an interesting transition where kids are just deciding from a young age, and that's going to continue to push that market forward, I believe, and continue to have good options that are nutritious, high protein, and that, I think that's really exciting. That's going to really help to move people in that direction. I feel like some of those sources, sometimes there's negative feelings about they're processed and they have several ingredients, but it's having a lot of ingredients isn't always a bad thing. A lot of times it's spices and oil and things that would go into a normal meal. So I feel like some of those things, that they're getting a lot better. I've been paying attention to that market. My son's been vegetarian for quite a while, and I was vegetarian for a bit in my 20s, and these products were not available the way that they are, and they're just, every time I go to a new store, every few months it seems like there's a new type of product out, and I feel like that's just going to continue to increase.
Exactly. I'm so excited that you said that, because a lot of people are worried about the label of processed foods, but sometimes these processed foods can actually be really healthy, and it could provide the necessary amount of protein for people who don't choose to eat red meat. And you're right, so many choices. I was plant-based when it was, it was very, very difficult. And I raised 2 kids. My son is 20, my daughter is 18. And I remember those Boca burgers saved our lives. Those Boca burgers were amazing. And TVP, we used to make TVP sauces with pastas and everything. But now we have so many choices. So it's really exciting to see that. Oh, by the way, I love your relationship with your son. I follow you on the stories and he's just adorable. And I love how you as a father make sure that he gets the right kind of foods and you show his little lunchbox. And it's just like one of the most favorite things for me on social media. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. For the average listener who's listening, and we have a lot of lovely people who are not in the realm of science and they're on social media and they see some really scary, fear-mongering messages going around about people saying, oh, you're going to suffer a lot if you don't eat red meat. And for them to eat better for long-term health without getting lost in diet wars, if you could give them a message of what is the simplest way to go around food based on their resources, because not a lot of people have the kind of resources and money to buy expensive food products, or even going plant-based requires some planning. What would be the message for the general average listener to make sure that they eat the right kind of diet?
I think one of the biggest things that people can do, and I know you and Dean are big advocates of this, is really just learning how to cook and learning how to make foods at home. That's going to be a much healthier option for most people. And you mentioned it's a lot lower cost. And when everything is increasing with everything, it's a way to save money. It's a way to, you can create meals that specifically designed for you. That's one of the reasons that I don't like going out to eat, is like, I'm like, either they're going to give me a meal that's too big or too small. And when you learn how to cook and spend that time and energy feeding yourself and learning how to feed yourself well and learning new recipes, and when it comes to cooking, it's just trying to include as many whole foods as you can, as many micronutrient rich foods, lots of colors, lots of vegetables. If you're cooking the vegetables, put more than you think you need, because it will cook down. That's one of the things I think a lot of people, when they include vegetables in their meals, they don't put enough. When I make a meal, I have an entire cutting board full of vegetables, and then when I cook it, it doesn't look like that much because it shrinks down so much. Increasing the amount of vegetables, adding some beans into your meals, choosing whole grains, choosing lower fat meat options, those simple things that you can do when you make your meals at home. It doesn't have to be that you're eating chicken and broccoli and rice every day. That's one of the things that I feel like is a huge misconception around eating healthy, is you should be eating foods that you enjoy, and you should be taking the types of foods that you already like and you enjoy that you're making or you're going out to eat, and figuring out how to make those at home in ways that taste good to you, that meet your nutrient needs, that provide enough protein and aren't doused with oil and fried things that you'll often get when you go out to eat. So I think really just putting that time and energy in. The challenge is, I think it's an investment to really learn the skills to be able to make healthier foods at home. And when you do that, it saves you money, and it really is going to help you improve your health over the long run. It's hard to eat healthy if you don't know how to cook meals that you enjoy and that you want to eat. And that's just a trial and error process sometimes.
My immense gratitude for Adrian for his incredible thoughts and conversation. So Adrian gave us a reality check on protein. Most people in the Western world don't experience protein deficiency. That's something that you see in really peculiar disease states, or in war zones, or in areas where there's famine, etc. And you've worked in the realm of public health and you've seen it. So have I. But that doesn't really happen here because we get enough calories, and most of us get more than we actually need. The small differences between animal and plant proteins don't really matter when you hit your daily needs. And I love that he basically dove into the spectrum of meat. He talked about processed meats, clearly harmful. He talked about fatty red meat. If it's in excess, that becomes risky. And he also talked about lean unprocessed meats, which is probably neutral in small doses. So I love that he actually brings this beautiful nuance into yes and no, or black and white, or yes meat or no meat. It's not like that.
And that's the way we need to approach it. In social media, nuance is the enemy. because you have 60 seconds to get people's attention, and nuance can't be done in 60 seconds. But I think I'm very optimistic, because I think the more we as a society have these conversations, the more familiar we become with nuance and directional data. So Dr. Chavez is just absolutely remarkable.
He's brilliant, and I love the fact that he's a big fan of cooking, which is really important. So both Christopher and Adrian kind of share that.
Yes.
And so do I. I mean, shameless plug. The reason I went to cooking school while I was getting my fellowship in New York was just that.
Yes.
Teaching people how to cook and take care of themselves, even if it's like 2 or 3 meals, it goes a long way. It really does make a huge difference.
Your programs, your community programs, built around teaching people some simple techniques of how to cook healthy foods and yet make them tasty, are probably the most popular programs I've ever seen. We've had thousands of people just come to watch you cook. That's why it's so powerful, because instead of lecture, people see it and they say, I can do it.
Yeah, I know. It's so empowering to actually see that, and it's so gratifying as well. All right, last but not least, we are joined by our friend, Dr. Matt Nagra. Matt is a licensed naturopathic doctor and expert in plant-based nutrition. He's written so much about it, and he's completely dedicated his life and is relentless about correcting misinformation in the field of nutrition. He presents it with hard science, with a lot of passion, especially when it comes to the topic of meat and protein and plant-based nutrition. So here is my conversation with Matt. Matt, as always, it's wonderful to have you back on Your Brain On podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I just heard that you went to Japan, and I've been binge watching your stories, and I'm so excited that you went there and you had great food. How was the tofu that you made?
The tofu, as I've already told you and I posted all about, was the best tofu, at least plain tofu I've ever had. Part of it is because I made it, so there's that. But also, we learned about like the different types of beans you can use to make tofu.
Amazing. I think the Japanese have a very unique way of making it, and the flavors that they add to it and the umami that comes along with all the other flavors is just incredible. So I'm really excited for you. And whenever I see you in Los Angeles, we always talk about food. We always go out to these amazing restaurants. When it comes to the bigger topic of nutrition, I'm so grateful for you for having this amazing platform of sharing evidence-based information with your followers and with the public. I'm so delighted to have you for this conversation, because the topic today is one that could potentially be a little touchy for people, because people feel very strongly about what they eat. We're talking about eating meat. And both you and I are vegans. We also have this outlook that addresses the differences that people own, and we completely respect it. And we also make sure that whatever we say is based on evidence-based science, and we get our feelings out of it. So I couldn't think of a better person for this conversation than you. So on social media, as you know, there's still a lot of confusion. Nutrition may not be perfect as a field, but I think we have enough data to help us understand what's good for us and what's not good for us. I wanted to start the conversation today by asking some questions. And the first one being, when it comes to the science of consumption of meat from the different trials, whether it's an observational study or even some clinical trials or even some ward studies, in your own words, can you describe what all of these studies have actually shown us? What is the evidence that what kind of foods and what kind of dietary patterns is good for our health?
So yeah, we can look at a couple different things. We can look at the research on overall dietary patterns, but we can also look at the research on individual foods and the impact that they have. There was a great meta-analysis by Schwingschakel, I always mess up his name, where they looked at different food groups and the risk of mortality, and they've done similar publications for cardiovascular disease and other conditions. Very consistently, they see that whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, and fish are associated with lower risks. Dairy sort of depends on the type of dairy. Meats, particularly red meats, and processed meats are associated with higher risks. And the same could be said, not necessarily in those studies because they didn't include them, but in other studies you see similar associations with ultra-processed foods as a general category. Really, that tells us that a diet dominated by those fiber-rich plant foods, with or without fish or certain dairy proteins, is sort of the foundation of a healthy dietary pattern. And then if we look at research on those dietary patterns, whether that's the Healthy Eating Index, which is based on the dietary guidelines, or the alternate Healthy Eating Index, which is essentially the same, but they add some additional details in there, Mediterranean diet, Mind diet, DASH diet, all of these share many of those same characteristics, and all of them are consistently associated with lower risks of cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality, etc. What's really interesting is if you look at the healthy eating index studies or the meta-analyses where they pool a bunch of studies together on the topic, and you look at the risk of mortality, there are very few areas of nutrition where I've seen results so consistent. If you look down what's called the forest plot, basically when we do a meta-analysis, you see all the individual studies lined up and the results from each one, and then you see the net result at the bottom. It's pretty much a straight line. You just don't see that with almost any other sort of intervention or exposure that you look at, whether it's a single food, whether it's exercise even. With the healthy eating index scores, it's incredibly consistent.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully stated. As far as meat is concerned, there are some loud voices there that are proponent for consumption of meat, stating that it is a better form of protein. And the concept or the conversation around quality of protein, which you have addressed in many of your conversation, comes about over and over again. I mean, I understand why it keeps coming back, even though there's plenty of evidence that shows it's essentially the same thing. You can get amino acids from plants and from animal proteins as well. Clarify this confusion between, quality of protein between plants versus meat or animal products.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few different ways that you could define quality. Some people will look at the amino acid profiles and suggest that some plant foods have more varied amino acid profiles, so they have more certain amino acids, less of others. In case anyone needs clarity, those are like the building blocks of protein. But then meat and other animal proteins tend to be pretty consistent across the board as far as their amino acid contents. However, there are some plant foods that are similar, like soy is one excellent option there. Even though the amino acid profiles vary in plant-based foods, if you eat some variety of plant-based foods, that's not a problem, because if grains are lower in one amino acid like lysine, you'll get that from beans and vice versa. I feel like I don't get that argument as often nowadays. It still comes up once in a while, but people have really shifted to the protein digestibility, or like how much of the protein are we presumably absorbing, to suggest that plant proteins are inferior. And I think this is largely based on a misunderstanding of what protein digestibility is and what the scores that are used are actually measuring. People I've seen say that, you only absorb like 60% of the protein from plants. That is completely false. That's based on a couple scoring systems called the PDCAS and the DAS. So long form protein digestibility corrected amino acid score and digestible indispensable amino acid score. Basically what they do is they feed different foods to either rodents or pigs, depending on which score we're looking at, and they measure how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end. And presumably the difference is the amount that's absorbed. Now, in the DIAS score, they actually don't go all the way to the digestive tract. They look till the end of the small intestine. They insert a tube and suck it out that way. One of the problems there, or there's a couple problems. For one, we aren't rodents, we aren't pigs. We have different digestive tracts, we have different protein needs, we have different growth rates. So we can't directly translate those results to humans. Another problem is that, especially with the DIAS score, where they're using it in pigs, they often use raw foods. So like raw grains, raw beans, and you're not going to absorb those as well as you would if you were to cook them, which is how we typically consume them. Almost nobody ever mentions. They don't just look at the digestibility of protein, they look at how much of the lowest amino acid in that food you absorbed. Let's paint a picture. If you had a protein that had 100% of your needs of 8 of the essential amino acids, but only 50% of your needs for one of the amino acids. And now let's just say, for sake of argument, to make the math easy, you absorbed 100% of the protein. So that would be a highly bioavailable protein. You would still only get a score of 50. And that's because there's only 50% of that lowest amino acid in there, or at least of your needs or whatever you're comparing it to. It'd be like if you had a report card and you had straight A pluses on 8 subjects, but you got like a C minus on one subject, and your report card only reads C minus. Nobody sees the A pluses or anything. It's just, that's your grade. And that's sort of how these protein systems work. So they bias the results against plant protein on the basis of the varied amino acid profiles, which are no longer a problem if you just eat more than one food.
That's right. Yeah, no, I've seen some videos where there are these influencers who put meat on one side, and then on the other side, as a comparison, they put things like brown rice or, maybe something that has the least amount of protein. And I was like, why are you comparing those two when we have better foods like tofu or tempeh or seitan or certain types of lentils and beans? So I agree with you. I think there is like a little bit of understanding, or maybe there's some trickery in that conversation as well. I don't know their purpose, but generally the consensus is that if you include a variety of different plant foods, you are going to meet those amino acid needs in your body. And along with that food package comes protein and micronutrients and polyphenols and so many other things that are good for your health and for your brain health as well, specifically. What are your thoughts about eating meat in specific? So what is it in meat that may potentially be bad for us?
One thing I think we should clarify is that dose really matters here, and also what you're comparing it to really matters here. So when we're looking at actual outcomes, is a serving of meat a week going to be problematic? Probably not. I don't see anybody can reasonably argue that. But we're talking if you're having it regularly, if you're having it daily. And there we do see increases in risk in, again, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and in a recent study out of the Nurses' Health and Health Professionals Follow-Up studies in all-cause mortality as well, are, for one, the saturated fat content. Red meat can be high in saturated fat. You can choose extra lean cuts that are lower in saturated fat, and that would certainly be a better option. There's also dietary cholesterol. Some people genetically absorb a ton of cholesterol. Some people genetically don't absorb any. The effect varies depending on genetics, but it also depends on your background diet. If you're eating a healthy, low cholesterol, plant predominant diet and you add more cholesterol to it, you actually absorb more cholesterol. If you eat a standard Western cholesterol rich diet and you add more cholesterol to that, it won't change very much. So there's some nuance there. Now there's also heme iron, and there's some research behind how that might contribute to plaque development, how it might contribute to insulin resistance, how it might contribute to cancer progression or cancer development, especially with regard to colorectal cancer. And then we have the outcomes to support those conditions. And then there's a number of other compounds like New5GC, which is this carbohydrate compound, and there can potentially have oxidative properties or inflammatory properties. We can go down the list picking apart these individual components that may play a role. And that's interesting. And it certainly helps us in terms of if we want to look at ways to prevent those risks or target specific compounds, or maybe when it comes to cultured meat, how to formulate them in a healthier way. But when it comes to the actual clinical outcomes at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters for us to conclude that meat leads to these outcomes, because it's the package that matters. And we see in the research on that full package, if you're having, say, a serving a day or more, about 100 grams serving a day, that leads to worse outcomes. Again, is that going to be the case for a serving or so a week? Probably not.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's very important for people to know that dose definitely matters. For people trying to live a healthier life, even cutting it down to not eating it on a daily basis and maybe reducing it to a couple of times a month or maybe even like a couple of times a week, I think that's always a good thing. Talk to us about processed meats. I think the distinction between red meat and processed meat is important. We have a lot of evidence showing that processed meat could potentially increase the risk of several types of disease outcomes, including cardiovascular disease, and in the world of neurology, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and vascular dementia as well. What is it about processed meat that is not good for us?
I would say that's one that even a lot of meat eaters would agree with is probably not great for us at this point. There's very little pushback. Some people will push back a bit, but for the most part, I think there's agreement there. Because of the way that processed meats are treated, and these are meats that have been treated with like salts or other preservatives, the high salt content is problematic. Oftentimes they have added fats as well. The nitrites they're treated with can actually lead to some of the carcinogenic potential in our colon when we consume it. In fact, heme iron can actually turn into those after consumption as well. So that's an interesting tidbit on how red meat might contribute to risk. So there's a number of ways they might contribute to risk. They're also more hyperpalatable because of the salt and the fat combination. That is one of the combinations that leads us to consume more and prevents that sort of satiety signal from fully getting there. So there's a number of mechanisms by which it might contribute to overeating, to the high salt content affecting blood pressure and whatnot, the cholesterol content, the saturated fat content, and then of course these nitrates and nitrites. So, could we pick apart exactly what percentage is attributable to each of those? I don't know that we can, but we see that the package is certainly of concern.
Yeah, absolutely. At a time where we're learning how to plan our diets and make sure that we get all the nutrients necessary for our bodies, we still come across these conversations and statements like meat is a complete food. It has all the micronutrients and the protein that you can take. Why is it that some people are so vehemently pro-consumption of meat when we know that you can get vitamin B12, you can get protein, you can get your fiber from other foods that are not meat?
So for one, when it comes to, meat provides everything you need, go ahead and plug in 3,000 calories, forget 2,000, 3,000 calories of meat into Chronometer or MyFitnessPal and see if you hit all your nutritional targets. You don't. I've asked so many carnivores in my comments to provide me with a carnivore meal plan that hits all nutritional targets, and they can't. I even said we'll exclude fiber to be generous, and they still can't. This whole idea that it provides everything you need is just bogus. As far as it having a fair amount of nutrition, sure, I can grant that. I wouldn't argue that it comes with a fair number of micronutrients, but so does a multivitamin. By their logic, if nutrient content is what dictates health value, then multivitamin should be like the healthiest thing out there. yet a lot of them are against that. And also, I don't like the idea of just focusing on nutrient content as a means for determining if a food is healthy. We want to look at health outcomes. Meat might provide you with certain nutrients like vitamin B12, but it also increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, of type 2 diabetes, potentially, of colorectal cancer. So there's a huge trade-off there if you're having it regularly. Now, if you're having it once in a while, maybe it doesn't lead to those outcomes, but you're also not getting much nutrition from it because you're having it once in a while. So you're not getting that benefit anyway. I think it's just a way to try to justify recommending high levels of meat consumption, not even for oneself, but as you mentioned, there's many influencers out there with credentials of some form who are promoting this. I think it's a part of just having some kind of argument to support their case.
I suppose the whole purpose of this platform and our podcast and my conversation with you is to inform our listeners and our audience about what the evidence is showing and for them to decide what is best for them. It's just bizarre that we have some platforms saying that vegetables have things like, anti-nutrients that do not allow them to be absorbed properly. And yet you see different studies, different research lines, whether they're cohort studies or randomized control trials showing that people who eat fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, they tend to be the healthiest. They have the lowest risk of cardiovascular disease, lowest risk of Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, in my field, the neurology field, Parkinson's disease. And they tend to be cognitively brilliant for a very long time. And it's really important for people to know why we're getting these small little roadblocks on our path. When it comes to the area of mental health, there's a large group of population who think that going keto, following a ketogenic diet is the best way to do it. And the best data that we have for the ketogenic diet is longer than 3 months and no more than maybe 100 people. Small human-based studies, and the outcomes are so vague. The methodology is not appropriate. That's just not good enough data for us to make it a public health messaging. And I'm sure you've actually heard about some of the data on ketogenic diet for heart health and cardiovascular health is concerned. They can actually be really dangerous if it's high in saturated fats, isn't it?
That's the one thing I was going to bring up is that the types of fats really matter here. So if you're doing a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet that's rich in unsaturated fats, especially those polyunsaturated fats, it's not clear that would be necessarily detrimental. Now, if you're doing a medical keto diet, which is extremely low carbohydrate, also low protein, and high in fat, which was traditionally used to treat epilepsy, you can pretty easily run into nutritional deficiencies because of how restrictive that diet is. If you're focusing on more of the unsaturated fats and limiting saturated fat, I think it could be done in a healthy way. We don't have a ton of data on it. We have the Eco Atkins data from David Jenkins, fellow Canadian, or say that. But, research out of his crew, and there's some benefit there for cardiovascular risk factors, but it also wasn't super ultra low carb. It was pretty low though. It was close to what a kind of standard keto diet would be.
Yeah. Trial after trial in the field of neurology says that if you are consuming saturated fats, it's associated with higher risk of stroke, higher risk of vascular dementia, higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. And there's close correlation between saturated fat consumption and higher LDL cholesterol. High LDL cholesterol was recently added to the list of modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. The Lancet Commission for Dementia Prevention, they post, a report that comes out every 2 to 3 years. The one that came out in 2024, guess what? 2 things were added: LDL cholesterol and hearing loss. We know that LDL cholesterol can definitely increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and other brain diseases. New research came out. It was essentially a Mendelian randomization looking at specific genes that exemplified how specific markers of low cholesterol impacted brain health. And lo and behold, again, the markers that are usually lowered with taking statins or taking cholesterol medication was associated with better brain health outcomes. So whether it's heart health or brain health, we know that lowering LDL and now ApoB as we know it is incredibly important. And, at a party, whenever we go somewhere, when people ask us, okay, well, just tell us what to do. What is the one thing that you want us to keep an eye on for health and longevity? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Any standard general health blood test that you're going to get done, at least at a certain age, is going to test for that.
Something that your insurance covers and something you can get with your primary care physician. Just check your LDL cholesterol and make sure it's within normal limits.
On the low end of normal.
Low end of normal.
So, yeah.
Exactly. That's very true. Talk to us about choline. Choline comes up over and over again as a very important element for health. What are your thoughts on that?
So I just co-authored a paper with David Goldman on this. It's not out yet though, so stay tuned, I guess. I think it's in review. But anyways, you're getting a little insight here. So yeah, choline, this was really, I feel like, popularized with there was a UK nutritionist who wrote a paper back 2018, 19, somewhere in that range, maybe 17. And I feel like it really blew up and really started having people question, like, are you getting enough choline on plant-based diets? And so choline is a nutrient that we know impacts liver health. We know it can impact brain health, but we do make choline. In fact, we can satisfy some of our choline needs by another nutrient called betaine. Now, if you're consuming more betaine, you need less choline and vice versa. That's an area that I think we don't actually fully understand at this point, like what is the minimum cutoff for maintaining good health, because there are other variables that affect it, and because in the population, overt choline deficiency is extremely rare. If we look at what the needs are based on the adequate intake here in North America, it's 525 milligrams for men and 450 for women, give or take 25. Now, the majority of the population gets less than those numbers. This tells us that cutoff might be higher than is necessary. Now, what that cutoff was based on was largely a single trial from the 90s where they had one group consuming about 500 or 550 milligrams of choline, and then another group consuming just like 50 milligrams, very low intake, maybe 75 milligrams. And they found that the group getting the low choline diet did run into issues, particularly liver-related issues. So that tells us that, okay, this low number is too little and this high number is enough. But it doesn't tell us where that line should be drawn. And just because we don't have more rigorous data at this point testing out the various levels, they go with the higher values. And then they lower it a bit for women based on like body weight differences and whatnot on average. But that's essentially where the numbers came from. So at this point, we don't know. Now, if we think about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, if we think about dementia, we see that plant-based diets are associated with lower risks. We actually have randomized controlled trials demonstrating that for at least liver fat accumulation, that more plant-based foods tend to be better, that unsaturated fats tend to be better there, even when calorie equated. We have good evidence that plant-based diets are healthy when it comes to the outcomes that choline should impact. However, I would not take that to mean that we should discount any importance of choline. Like I said, it is essential to a degree that the amount is questionable, but we need some. And you can get some from certain plant foods, a reasonable amount from certain plant foods like soy products, like seeds, in particular, pumpkin seeds are great. So and actually cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and that are really good sources, Brussels sprouts. So you can certainly get it through plant foods. If you're eating a diverse plant-based diet, I don't know that it's something that requires a ton of attention. The one exception I would give is pregnancy. Pregnancy, there is some data suggesting it can improve cognitive outcomes in the child. It is a relatively common nutrient in prenatal vitamins as well at this point. It's something that I feel like has been added more and more recently. So I see it quite often. Outside of that, I don't know that it's something to overthink just because we don't really have good data that you're lacking on a plant-based diet, provided you have some diversity and overall good diet quality.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was pregnant. My kids are adults now, 20-year-old and 18-year-old. And I remember my prenatal vitamins having choline, and thank goodness they're both healthy and brain healthy. I mean, there's an N of one. I can't really just bring myself up as like, oh, I did it. But it shouldn't be a problem nowadays. And you're right. I think the data is not very certain. We don't even have a recommended daily allowance. We don't have an RDA for choline. What is the acronym you used?
Adequate intake. It's AI.
It's an AI.
So it's based for certain nutrients where we don't have a hard line, like understanding, hey, this is really the cutoff for deficiency, but it's something just to like cover your bases because we get an adequate intake. And so we have that for choline. We actually have it for omega-3s, specifically the ALA, the plant form of omega-3s, and some other nutrients. I'd say most of the important micronutrients, we have the RDAs at this point.
Thank you for saying that. Can you shed some light on carnitine? I mean, carnitine, the word carne means meat. It is an element that comes from meat, and there's discussions around it. Tell us what the role of carnitine is for health and whether it's something for us to be aware of. What is it specifically?
So it's involved in like fat metabolism. So like in the mitochondria for carrying fats so that they can be used for energy and whatnot. But it's non-essential nutrient. We make it. We make the carnitine that we need. Some mediators will still argue that we don't get enough, but I have not seen really good evidence for that. In fact, it's sometimes added to things like energy drinks or pre-workouts. Even the research on athletic performance is very weak for carnitine, like shockingly weak. So I don't know that there's a lot of value or good evidence of real value there. Maybe in certain conditions, but for the general population, it's not very compelling. However, I actually have concerns about consuming high amounts of carnitine regularly. So there was one randomized controlled trial in postmenopausal women with metabolic syndrome, saw greater progression of atherosclerotic plaques in the carnitine group versus placebo group. So that's one potential concern, or at least the narrowing of the artery. And then to add to that, we have a couple Mendelian randomization studies, again, looking at genetic variants that impact the amount of carnitine that you produce or have in your body. They found that higher levels were associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular events like heart attacks. There's a caveat that after they accounted for the possibility of a false finding, it wasn't statistically significant anymore. So it's one of those things where maybe be cautious about. There isn't really good, clear evidence of benefit. I probably wouldn't recommend supplementing it regularly or taking it in high amounts. And based on that data, I mean, it's possible that the carnitine in meat is one of the contributors to its cardiovascular risk. But we just need more data there to really confirm or refute those findings.
Absolutely. Beautifully stated. And as far as iron is concerned, people are concerned that they may not get enough iron if they adhere to a plant-based diet or if they reduce their meat consumption. And sometimes it's very easy for people to consume red meat as a source of iron. Can you shed some light on what we know about the importance of iron for health and longevity? And what are some of the trade-offs for people not eating meat to get iron?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to shout out another paper we just published, David Goldman and myself.
You've been busy.
Yeah,
I'm so
looking
excited.
at the sort of, we have a couple more
Amazing.
on the go. But anyways, on the whole, you need to carefully plan plant-based diets argument, because we argue that applies to any diet if you want to be healthy. One of the things that we talked about in there was the iron. And what's interesting is we do see that vegans and vegetarians tend to have lower iron status, so lower ferritin levels compared to meat eaters. However, when you actually account for inflammation, so you adjust for their inflammatory markers, that difference goes away. There's actually no significant difference. As inflammation goes up, you actually end up storing more iron as ferritin. So it's actually an inflammatory marker in a way. The differences might be a result of differences in inflammation, and the plant-based eaters tend to have less. So it's not clear that there's a significant difference. We also don't see differences in rates of anemia between vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters, or especially between vegans and meat eaters. With vegetarians, in some cases, especially in impoverished nations, where vegetarianism is tied to poor diet quality a lot of the time. So it's not clear that it's a big problem. You do absorb more heme iron than non-heme iron from plant foods, and that's often used as an argument for consuming more red meat. However, when you consider that plant foods, especially like legumes, lentils, and so on, have way more iron than meat. You'll get double the amount of iron that you'll get from a similar size serving of meat.
A lot of people don't know this.
Yeah. Even if you absorb less, let's say you absorb half as much, you still get as much iron. And so that might partially at least explain why we don't see significant differences in anemia rates between vegans and meat eaters, at least in more developed nations. So it's not clear that it's a huge problem. Actually, there was a really cool study that looked at non-heme iron absorption, so the type of iron that is found in plants, or the exclusive type of iron in plants. And they found that vegans actually absorb more than meat eaters. If you're not consuming heme iron, there seems to be, for some reason, that you absorb more of the non-heme to sort of compensate. So there's a lot of mechanisms at play, and I think this issue is a bit overblown as it pertains specifically to plant-based eaters. But iron deficiency as a whole is a huge problem. It's the number one nutrient deficiency in the world. It affects either people with food insecurity or especially women of reproductive age because of their menstrual cycles. Some of the most effective treatments are iron supplements, or in some cases, iron infusions. Consuming more meat might not really move the needle all that much.
Beautifully stated. Amazing. This was great. I'm definitely going to make this a reel. That was fascinating. So you're basically saying that sometimes when people have reduced iron, the relationship between iron and ferritin and inflammation, it's important for people to check their iron and ferritin as well. And they need to look at the iron binding capacity. Does that change initially when people start eating less meat and go more towards plant-based diet? Because there are a lot of people that get alarmed when their iron levels go down.
That's interesting. I'm not sure about the TIBC and the free iron. Ferritin tends to be a bit lower for the vegans for sure. But then if that correlates with a reduction in inflammatory markers like CRP, well, that would be expected, because ferritin itself is an acute phase reactant. It reacts to inflammation and you get a higher number. That's actually a really good question. That's something I'm going to have to look at now.
Fascinating. Okay, so we talked about carnitine, choline. Let's talk about B12. Now, we know that B12 is so important for multiple different processes in the body and for our brain. Whether it's central nervous system or peripheral nervous system, it has very intrinsic, detailed actions. One of the first things I do in my clinic when people come in with cognitive impairment is check their B12 levels, because that is a very easy and modifiable thing you can do for cognition. And people usually try to say that a meat-based diet or consumption of meat is important to get sources of vitamin B12 in our body. What are your thoughts on that?
Supplements exist. Like we don't need to rely on meat to get enough B12. B12 is absolutely really important. I now see a subset of vegans or raw fruitarians and whatnot suggesting that we don't even need to supplement B12, that it's all a scam. That is nonsense. We have so much data now on reversing B12 deficiency through just supplementation with B12 in different forms. It's not something for plant-based eaters to mess around with, whether that's consuming fortified foods multiple times per day or just taking a simple, cheap, high-dose supplement that covers your needs. And that's usually what I suggest because it's so reliable, it's so cheap. You buy a bag in bulk of the high dose that you take once a week and you can get like a year's supply for $14. So it's like crazy cheap. So yeah, it's absolutely an important thing to get. Now, some people will argue that the bioavailability or the effectiveness of B12 for meat is for some reason better, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So we actually have a randomized controlled trial in kids somewhere in Africa, I can't recall where they had poor diet quality. B12 deficiency was common, and they had them supplement either unfortified cereal, B12 fortified cereal, or pork. And they standardized the amount of B12 in the fortified cereal with the amount in the pork. B12 levels actually rose more in the cereal group, and cognitive performance improved in both groups because they were getting B12. And so that shows us that the fortified cereal, essentially the supplement version of B12, was better. And it makes total sense that it would be. So when we consume animal products for B12, the B12 is bound to protein. And we need sufficient stomach acid production to like break that apart, and then we have to absorb it. When we're looking at free B12 through a supplement source, some of it will be carried across the intestinal membrane, but some of it will just pass through passive diffusion. Supplements are such a high dose, often 100 times or more the RDA, because if you give a high dose, a small amount will just pass right on through without needing to rely on stomach acid or protein carriers or anything like that. Yeah, supplements are extremely effective. And that's another reason why the Institute of Medicine recommends that elderly individuals supplement regardless of their diet. Stomach acid production declines as we age, so even if you're eating those foods, the meats and whatnot, you might not be absorbing enough B12.
Absolutely. I think there was an NHANES study a while back that showed that about 41% of adults in the United States, regardless of their dietary patterns, had vitamin B12 deficiency. So it's not necessarily just a problem of people who are avoiding meat. It is definitely a problem that can increase as we age. Being very, very aware of our vitamin B12 levels are incredibly important.
I think on that note, there's one caveat to that 41% number, and that's I think it was suboptimal B12. Mm-hmm. So like it was a level that could be deficiency. It might not be. It was sort of in that middle range, but either way, lower than where you probably want it to be as a safety measure.
That's good to know. And the conversation that comes around saying things like, well, our grandfathers or great-grandfathers or grandparents never took any vitamin B12 and they were fine. And my answer is like, how do you know? How do you know they were fine? Yeah. I mean, no disrespect to anybody, but, back then, fine. Right now, everybody wants to have peak performance, and we want to be, very sharp, and we want like great memory, and we want to be physically fit. We are really attuned to our needs, and we're aware of how to keep an eye on all of these nutrient levels and biomarkers. But back then, nobody really tested anyone for their memory to see whether they were actually cognitively active or not. Nobody actually really cared about the biomarkers in the body. So we're all trying to be better, and we're all very, very aware of the different kind of tests that are available right now. So you said something earlier about planning around plant-based diet, but I think you're right. It's not just around plant-based diet, it's any dietary pattern.
I 100% agree. That careful planning caveat often points towards micronutrient intake, maybe protein intake too, if you want to include a macronutrient. But for one, every dietary pattern has its certain pitfalls. So even a omnivorous diet tends to be lower in magnesium, in potassium, in fiber. And so there's certain nutrients that they might need to focus more on. But then if we step back and we look at the health outcomes, we see that vegans and vegetarians tend to be healthier in the long term. So there's an added risk there for the at least more typical omnivorous diets that, would require careful planning to sort of dance around, that risk as far as making sure you're getting enough fiber, making sure saturated fat intake is low, making sure if you are consuming red meat, limiting it to maybe once or twice a week, focusing on lean options. These are all things that would require some level of planning. And that's what actually led David Goldman, my co-author there, to want to write it. Is he's like, this got mentioned to me too many times, and so I just want to publish something on it.
That's fantastic. I think this is such an important topic. I'm going to ask you some simple, direct questions because we have our lovely audience listening to this. For people who want to live a healthy life, let's say they're very in tuned about their nutrition and they want to make the right decisions. The understanding that we have from this episode and from conversations with you and other speakers is reduction of meat is associated with better health. But for people who don't want to let go of their meat at all, it's best for them to reduce it. How low should they go for better health outcomes? You said once or twice a week, and then you talked about lean meat. Can you expand on that a little bit so that people could actually have some directions?
Yeah, so if we look at the smallest dose associated with risk, and this was in a really well conducted study by Zong, published in JAMA, I believe, they were looking at several cohorts in the US. They found that per each 2 servings of unprocessed red meat per day, there was a few percent increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease, and all-cause mortality I think was around the same. That's a very small increase in risk for what is essentially a very small increase in meat intake, just a couple servings a week. And so around that, is that super meaningful? I would say to most people, probably not. Obviously, I can't speak for anybody, though. They might look at that and, hey, a few percent is a lot to me. But if that's the type of risk that you're comfortable with, potentially, then yeah, a couple servings a week is probably reasonable. But as you increase from there, once you get to a serving a day, those risks go up, especially if you're looking at consuming it in the place of plant protein. Replacing even just 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein, specifically if it's from red meat, can lead to something like a 15 to 20% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality. That's a huge benefit for what is essentially less than a typical serving of red meat per day. I want people to think about those incremental sort of steps that you make. So if you can shift 3% of your calories from the animal protein to plant protein, especially if it's red meat protein we're talking about, that's a win. Now, if you still have some of the meat in there, okay. But just understand that you can make those small shifts and gain something from it. And it's not an all or nothing thing.
Brilliant as always. Matt drew from the global consensus across dietary patterns like the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, the MIND diet, and of course the plant predominant diet. And I think it's essentially a variation of the same theme. The kind of foods that protect our brain health and cardiovascular health are the ones that are prominent in these dietary patterns: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. I really appreciated the fact that he broke down why meat, particularly in large quantities or processed meats, can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease, and it has been shown to raise the risk for Parkinson's disease and, of course, cardiovascular disease as well. He talked about heme iron, which is really interesting. And of course, I think it's very, very clear. There's really no doubt about the fact that saturated fat intake, if people eat a lot of saturated fats, that could potentially increase the risk of both Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease. It's funny that sometimes kind of gets missed in some populations. And I mean, no disrespect to anyone, but when you look at or when you sit down with individuals who follow a carnivore diet, their reasoning just kind of goes into this avenue where there's not a lot of data that supports it. And somehow they just close their eyes and ears and they just continue with that path. And, you and I have talked about it. I'm just wondering, why is it that when there is tremendous amount of data, people just continue to follow a path to essentially support their biases? Why does that happen from a behavioral neurology perspective?
If we don't attribute malice to them, let's say financial gain only, and that's a possibility. There are some people that support an idea because they know that there's going to be a lot of people following them because people love hearing good news about their bad habits. And given that a majority of the world is meat eaters, they know that if they just give the kind of language that gives the greater population the support they need, they're going to have following. So there are those. But outside of that malice, I think the other factor that could explain the ignoring of the profound amount of data is the fact that most of the time individuals in this situation are driven by confirmation bias. And when somebody is driven by affinity that comes from culture, religion, or from history, and they have conviction for that, then what people usually do is create language around that. You confirm the bias. You find the data that confirms that bias. Remember Alex, how old was he? I don't know. Alex and Sophie had this channel, and I think he was 8 years old.
7, 8.
And they did a video on confirmation bias. It's the funniest thing. We have to share that.
I wonder if we could actually put a clip of that in the podcast.
I think we should. It is hilarious.
Hello everybody, I'm Alex. Today I'm going to be talking about probably one of the most important topics in science, confirmation bias. One of the most common logical fallacies that we always use. I probably used it like 6 times today, is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is actually a logical fallacy in which you try to prove everything you believe in right. You try to find everything that proves your beliefs and biases correct. But anything that doesn't agree with what you think, well, you just completely ignore it.
He did a good job.
He did a phenomenal job. And confirmation bias is a thing. It's a reality. It's powerful. What we do is we latch on to an idea because of those affinities, historic, cultural, religious, or otherwise. And then you look for data to confirm that. There's mouse research data. There are all these anecdotal data. There's molecular data. You can find data. So we always say, don't just assume that if you find a piece of data, then that's the final story. All scientists should lean in a direction once there's a significant amount of data coming from multiple kinds of research and produced by others.
Agreed. And not to digress too much from the topic, but I'm very interested because, people Matt Nagra does such an amazing job on his social media. And we have Adrian, who does a great job, and Alan Flanagan. And, there's such amazing people in the realm of nutrition that are pushing this conversation of evidence-based nutrition. And then suddenly you just see groups and peoples, and even people who have MDs and PhDs next to their name. Like, for example, there is this Harvard doctor who basically wrote a book and said that meat is the best kind of protein for brain, and it literally helps the brain stay healthy. And people who are vegetarians or who stop eating red meat, they start having, degeneration and shrinkage of the brain. And
no data, basically.
Data is king?
Yep.
Data is king. As far as the data is concerned, we have the dietary patterns that have looked at risk of dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia or other neurological diseases like stroke and Parkinson's disease. We know that the MIND diet from Rush University or the Mediterranean diet, when you look at the dietary pattern, it's a scoring system. People essentially get a high score if they consume fruits and vegetables and whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and they get a lower score if they consume red meat, processed meats, or dairy products that have higher saturated fats. And so that's how it's scored. People who adhere to this dietary pattern, the ones that adhered very well, had a risk reduction up to 53%. And even moderate adherence resulted in 35% lowered risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Same thing goes for the Mediterranean diet. We have the Mediterranean diet and dementia, the EPIC Spain study, and it showed that higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet was associated with up to 20% lower dementia risk. Red meat intake was negatively scored in the Mediterranean diet index. PrediMed diet actually showed that when you supplement a Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil and mixed nuts, they had improved cardiovascular and cognitive outcomes over 5 years. Again and again, we see the same thing over and over again. Of course, there's going to be a couple of studies here and there. There was this one meta-analysis, but when you look at the methodology, there's always some tiny little flaw, or they probably don't look at the bigger picture, or they don't look at the quantity of meat consumed. So I'm happy that the more we look at different populations and different dietary patterns, the more we understand what a healthy dietary pattern for brain health looks like.
Absolutely.
And there's very little room for processed meats in it. And as far as red meats go, the less the better.
Absolutely. One of the most important things I think we try to do is to highlight research and data and science and separate science from ethics, science from politics, science from religion, and also more importantly, highlight the fact that science evolves. Those two things are important. And being comfortable with that is important. And one of the things that has happened in our own life is that when you and I first started becoming plant-based, it was more related to ethics, right?
Absolutely.
That's how.
It was purely that.
But I want the audience to realize that when it comes to the science, our science has evolved a little bit, but evolved with the data. And that's important because even in the plant-based world, there are ones that have become so dogmatic that they're always fighting us about olive oil now, things of that nature.
I think that's silly.
Yeah, and it's important to look at data independent of all the other issues that we're talking about. And when you look at the data around meat and around food, it appears that more plant-based is good. You already discussed the fact that ultra-processed meat is not helpful for you. And then lean meat is basically a wash. And then something like fish, especially fatty fish, twice a week seems to be beneficial in some studies. Of course, that has to be further studied. And that level of nuance is important to spread, that kind of thinking that we have to kind of go with the data, even if it doesn't fit our cultural background. In our case, our cultural background has evolved several times, but our own background is irrelevant. And I think by accepting this pattern of data analysis, we can all, as a society, start building around data analysis as opposed to our feelings, our proclivities, our tendencies, our desires, our cultural backgrounds. And then, and only then, we can actually make a difference with one of the most important factors of health, which is food.
Agreed. No, absolutely. I appreciate you saying that. It's always a very sensitive kind of topic because it is an important element in our life, our decision not to eat meat or animal products. And the ethics of it is something that is just, one of our core pillars of our life. And obviously, I think it's very clear that the impact of the meat industry on our planet, on the environment, is something that cannot be debated. We clearly understand the harm that it brings about, but that's a different topic. And when it comes to the nutrition aspect of it, I agree with you. I actually shudder and cringe at some of the statements that I've made in the past about meat because of the biases that I had. And I'm so happy that I've had the opportunity to think, read more, look at the entirety of science, work with human beings. And I think that's a humbling experience in itself, especially when you look at social determinants of health or the level of access to fresh fruits and vegetables are concerned. That really puts things into context, and you work with people with their limitations and with their strengths to help them do the best that they can. It's quite clear that it's not a black or white situation. Like, for example, we have data that shows that even if you shift 3% of your calories from animal to plant proteins, you actually have better cardiovascular outcomes. And so it's not about purity, it's about direction.
And most of the changes that we do is not taking away things from people, is we just add more greens.
Yes, yes.
In fact, there are many communities where we don't even address the concept of taking away things. We just say, add more greens and do more walking. And just by those two factors, you've significantly improved your health parameters.
Very true. So let's summarize it for our lovely audience who really want the bullet points, the 1, 2, 3s. So when it comes to red meat, what is the recommendation right now? So we're talking about unprocessed red meats. As our speakers suggested, and as the data shows, eating it a couple of times a week, less than 100 grams per day or, per serving, a total of less than 200 grams per week is a good place to start. That's basically 2 servings. Choosing lean cuts if you are going with red meats. Cooking methodologies also play a role. Adrian spoke about it and Matt touched on it as well. Avoiding grilling or burning or charring, or if you are grilling, then adding some vinegar and some marinade to make sure that they don't create compounds that could potentially be harmful later on is important. And as far as processed meats are concerned, the less the better. Yeah. I really don't see a reason why you should be eating lunch meats and processed meats because of the harmful products that they have. And the data shows that there is a higher risk of having different diseases if you're consuming processed meats. And as far as poultry is concerned, it's definitely leaner than red meat. And as far as fish is concerned, there's really no data against fish at this point. So if people choose to eat fish, having 1 to 2 servings per week is great for brain health.
Especially fatty fish.
Yeah. But as far as recommendation for, the most optimal health is concerned, a plant predominant diet is great. Eating beans and lentils and vegetables and whole grains is incredible. And we know that people who consume a well-planned plant-based diet, they do very, very well. So instead of red meat, great things to eat would be beans. Legumes are dirt cheap too. Lentils stay on your shelf forever. And I think soybeans and tofu and tempeh also come under the realm of legumes. So tofu is really healthy. Tempeh is delicious. People can eat some nuts and seeds. They're not a very high source of protein, but they're a really good source of some good fats. Those are great replacements for red meat. I'm just going to describe what a healthy dietary pattern looks like from the Mind and the Mediterranean dietary pattern. So it would look like having maybe at least one or, 2 servings of green leafy vegetables per day. Fruits, berries, if you have access to it, are great for you. Frozen berries are excellent. Nuts, whole grains, extra virgin olive oil, and of course, beans and legumes.
And for those that are eating meat, I think fish twice a week is fine.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the considerations and one of the caveats in all of this conversation is that, and this may not be very popular, but the stronger protection may come from early, sustained dietary patterns rather than making these changes later in life. Does that mean that I'm saying it's too late for people to actually benefit from dietary patterns? I don't think I'm saying that. I'm saying that the longer you stay on a sustained, healthy diet, the kind of diet that you like and you can maintain, that's the best one for you.
Absolutely. It's not just a question of habit. It's a question of it affecting your systems over a long period of time, creating resilience, creating protection. And we know that that's probably the most important factor.
Very true. Very true. And at the end of the day, to make it really, really simple, if people could choose something like adding some greens or adding some beans without even getting rid of anything from their dietary patterns, they will see a lot of benefit. And so it's those small little additions and just being aware of their consumption of processed meats makes a huge difference for their brain health. And so we come to the end of the episode, Your Brain on Eating Meat. We are so grateful to our guests, Doctors Christopher Gardner, Adrian Chavez, and Matt Nagra, for their time and their expertise and sharing their knowledge with us. We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Until next time, take care, and thank you so much for listening.